Hello folks, it's Kofi here again, and welcome to my channel, TutorMed, where everything medicine is simplified. For those who are new here, I am a medical officer with the Department of Internal Medicine and Therapeutics at the Holy Family Hospital. In this video, we will be discussing one of the most confusing labs to interpret, the Hepatitis B profile. How do you tell the difference between an acute infection and a chronic one? And how do you differentiate between immunity acquired as a result of vaccination and that acquired as a result of a past infection? We will make this concept very simple, and if you find this useful, kindly like and share our video. Let us know your thoughts in the comment section, and as usual, kindly hit the subscribe button to get updated on our new video uploads. Alright, let's get to this. Well folks, to understand the profile, it is important we review the relevant microbiology of the virus. And here, we will pay attention to its three antigens. The first is the surface antigen, and then the envelope antigen, and lastly, the core antigen. These relevant antigens can be remembered by the first three letters of the word seconds: S, E, and then C. Please keep this in mind. Now, with these three relevant antigens at the back of our minds, let us revisit one basic principle of immunology. That principle that every antigen should stimulate antibody production once it enters our body and is recognized by our immune system. This means, in relation to the hepatitis B virus, each of the three antigens, the SEC, S-E-C, should stimulate antibody production. And so with that principle, the hepatitis B profile should give us 6 parameters. 1. The surface antigen and the surface antibody, the envelope antigen and the envelope antibody, the core antigen and then the core antibody. 6 parameters. However, the test is unable to assay the antigen at the core of the virus, one, because of its location and the fact that it is not secreted into circulation as molecules to be assayed, unlike the S and the E. And so we end with only 5 parameters on the profile, excluding the core antigen. Now, having understood the parameters we should expect to see on the profile, let us look at how they are designated on a sample test result. The surface antigen is designated as HBs antigen. The envelope antigen is designated as HBe antigen. The surface antibody is designated as anti-HBs. The envelope antibody as anti-HBe, and then the core antibody as anti-HBc. Now, what do these 5 parameters represent? What does it mean when they are positive or negative? Before illustrating them, it is important to mention that you cannot have an antigen and its corresponding antibody positive at the same time. For example, you cannot have the surface antigen and the surface antibody positive at the same time. To interpret the profile, always remember the acronym SEC. The first thing to do when interpreting the profile is to look at the S family, the S antigen and the S antibody. When the surface antigen is positive, it indicates that the individual has an infection at the time of the test. And when the surface antibody is positive, it indicates immunity. Are you noticing something here? Do you notice that whatever the antigen represents, its antibody represents the opposite? For example, look at the surface antigen. When the surface antigen is telling us that the individual has an infection, its antibody, when positive, tells us that the individual has developed immunity. And here comes another principle that we should keep in our heads, that whatever the antigen indicates, its antibody indicates the exact opposite. And so we can apply this to the next family, which is the E family, the E antigen and the E antibody. The E antigen, when positive, indicates that the person has a virus which is actively replicating. So from the principle, can you guess what its antibody would indicate when it is positive? Yes, you guessed right. The antibody would indicate that the virus is redundant. Another way to look at this is that when the antigen, the E antigen, is positive, it indicates that the virus is multiplying, multiplication. So what do you think the antibody would indicate if it's positive? Opposite of multiplication is mute. The virus is mute. However, for the C family, remember that we don't have a C antigen in the profile. So the C tells us the duration of the infection, if there is any. Now let's look at the steps used to interpret the hepatitis B profile. First, look at the S family and ask which of them is positive. If the surface antigen is positive, then there is an infection. The next question is, if there is an infection, is the virus multiplying or the virus is mute? To answer this, you ask the E family. Next, if there is an infection, how long has it been? You ask the C antibody. Depending on which antibody you see on the profile, it can tell you whether the patient has an acute infection or a chronic infection. We will look at this later. How about if the surface antibody rather is positive? If it is positive, it indicates that the individual is immune. The individual has immunity. Then the question is, this immunity, is it because the patient was vaccinated or because the patient has survived a past infection? We will look at how to decipher this. But for now, kindly take note of the steps used to interpret the profile. First, the S family, the E family, and then the C family. How will the profile of a patient with acute hepatitis B infection look like? Because there is an infection, the surface antigen will be positive, while the surface antibody will be negative. The virus is likely to be multiplying, and so the envelope antigen is likely to be positive, while its antibody will be negative. The core antibody will be positive, specifically the IgM. It is the IgM antibody which indicates to us that the infection is an acute one, while IgG will indicate a chronic infection, because IgM is the antibody which is produced in the first 6 months of any infection. So here, the relevant findings are a positive surface antigen, which would indicate an infection, and a positive core antibody, the IgM type, which would indicate to us that the patient has an acute infection. Can you guess what the profile of a patient with an actively replicating chronic hepatitis B infection will look like? Yes, you guessed right. The surface antigen will be positive because the patient has the infection, while its antibody will be negative because the patient has not developed immunity. Because the virus is actively replicating, the envelope antigen will be positive, while its antibody will be negative. And because it is a chronic infection, the core antibody will be positive, but this time it won't be the IgM, but the IgG. So relevant findings here are a positive surface antigen because the patient has got the infection, a positive envelope antigen because the patient has an actively replicating infection, and a positive core antibody, the IgG type, because the patient has a chronic infection. Hey folks, please don't forget to take a break to like and share our video, and also hit the subscribe button. Now, remember one of the principles we stated initially, that an antigen and its antibody cannot be positive at the same time? Here is the explanation. The explanation here is that an antibody can only be positive when it has neutralized all the antigens. And so, until it is able to do so, the antigen will be the predominant molecule in the family. However, both of them can be negative at the same time. And here is where the concept of seroconversion comes inside. Seroconversion can be simply explained this way: that the antibody titers and the antigen titers are equal in amount such that they have neutralized each other, and so there is no predominant molecule in the blood. So you can have the E antigen and the E antibody all negative. What it means is that family is in seroconversion. The antibody has neutralized all the antigens. So if this test is repeated some other time, you will find that the antibody titers will start emerging because this time they have exceeded the titers of the antigen. Now let us turn our attention to how to distinguish between patients who have acquired immunity because they have survived a past infection from those who acquired it because they were vaccinated. The difference here is that the former group was exposed to the original viral particle, while the latter group was exposed to a modified viral particle. When an individual gets infected with the hepatitis B virus, his system gets exposed to all the three antigens we know: the S antigen, the E antigen, and the C antigen. And so we expect that his system produces antibodies against all three antigens. However, in vaccination, the individual is given a modified viral particle such that the virus only has the S antigen, excluding the E and the C, and so the individual's system can only produce antibodies against the S. What this means is that both of them would have a positive surface antibody, which indicates that they are immune. But the vaccinated individual would have a negative C antibody because he was given a particle which did not contain a C antigen in the first place. Let's illustrate this and so let's look at the profile of the vaccinated individual. So as usual, the first place to go to is the S family. The antigen will be negative. Any reason why? Yes, because the patient hasn't got an infection. But the surface antibody will be positive, and this will indicate that the patient has immunity. Then the next question is, this immunity, is it because the patient has been vaccinated or the patient has survived a past infection? The person to ask is the core antibody. The core antibody here will be negative, Remember that the vaccinated individual was given a viral particle which didn't contain the core antigen, and so his system will not produce antibodies against a core antigen. So here the relevant findings are a positive surface antibody, which indicates immunity, and a negative core antibody, which indicates the fact that the patient was given a viral particle which did not contain the core antigen, and so was given a vaccine. Let's compare this to a patient who survived a past infection. And so for the survivor, how would the profile look like? The first place to go to again is the S family. Here, the surface antigen will be negative because the patient hasn't got an infection. He has survived the infection. The surface antibody will be positive, indicating that the patient is now immune. The next question, as usual, is this immunity, did it come because the patient was vaccinated in the past or because he survived an infection, a past infection? You go and then ask the core antibody. Now this patient got infected with a virus which had all three antigens, and so we will expect the core antibody to be positive. So here the relevant findings are a positive surface antibody, which indicates immunity, and then a positive core antibody, which indicates the fact that the patient got exposed to a real virus, not a modified virus or a vaccine. So the difference, really, between the vaccinated and the surviving patient is that all of them would have a positive surface antibody, which tells the doctor that they are immune. But the survivor would have a positive core antibody because he got exposed to a real virus, while the vaccinated would have a negative core antibody because the particle he got exposed to did not contain a C antigen. You may probably be wondering why I do not pay attention to the members of the E family when it comes to a patient who is immune. The reason here is that the patient who is immune has no virus in his system, and so there is no need to talk about viral replication or viral redundancy. Now let us pay attention to the profile of the individual who is susceptible or at risk of contracting the hepatitis B infection. In these individuals, their profile will show that all the 5 parameters are negative, right from the surface antigen to the core antibody. These patients will require immunization to provide immunity. The patients at risk here the most are health workers. So if you did your hepatitis B profile and you found out that all the 5 parameters are negative, it means you are susceptible. And since you'll be working around patients with hepatitis B, you need to get your vaccine to provide immunity. Now, there can be very rare instances where the interpretation of the profile is very difficult. There are cases where all parameters are negative, but the core antibody is positive. In this case, it could mean one of the following. It could mean that the patient has a resolved infection, or the patient has a falsely positive core antibody, the patient has a resolving acute infection, or the patient has a low-level chronic infection. Among these 4, the first reason is the most common. For these patients, we need to do hepatitis B DNA or viral load to confirm if there are still viral particles in the system. If there are no viral particles, then it could mean that the patient has a resolved infection or has a falsely positive core antibody, or has a resolving acute infection. But if there are, then it could also mean that the patient has a resolving acute infection or a low-level chronic infection. Okay, folks, let's look at some practice questions. The first question is, which of the following serological markers of hepatitis B represents high infectivity? A, the surface antigen. B, the core antibody, the IgG. C, the envelope antigen. D, the envelope antibody. And E, the surface antibody. Which of them do you think represents high infectivity? If your answer was C, then you would be right. Remember that the E antigen is a marker of replication. And so, if you are replicating too much, it means you have a high viral load. And a high viral load translates to high infectivity. It cannot be A because A is a marker of infection. It cannot be B because B is a marker of a chronic infection if the surface antigen is positive, or an immunity from a past infection if the surface antibody is positive. It cannot be D because the E antibody is a marker of a low infectivity, means that the virus is dormant, is mute. It cannot be E because the surface antibody is a marker of immunity. Now, for this set of questions, indicate whether they are true or false. The second question says, the core antibody, the IgM type, can be used to differentiate between an acute infection from a chronic hepatitis B infection. If your answer is true, then you would be right, because the core antibody has two types, the IgM and the IgG. The IgM represents an acute infection, while the IgG stands for a chronic infection. The third question. A patient who has had acute hepatitis B in the past and has cleared the virus will have positive core antibody and a positive surface antibody. If your answer is true, then you would be right. This patient has immunity, and the immunity came as a result of a survival from a past infection. That is why he had a positive core antibody. Now let's look at the last set of questions. A patient with a negative E antigen will always have a low hepatitis B viral load. If your answer is false, then you will be right. Generally, in medicine, there is nothing 100%. So words like always, invariably, always connotes a false answer. Even besides that, there are patients with hepatitis B particles which contain pre-core mutants. Those particles can have a negative E antigen and still have a high viral load. The last question. Hepatitis B vaccination induces a strong C antibody, response. If your answer is false, you will be right. Obviously, the vaccine does not contain the C antigen, and so it cannot induce a strong C antibody response, but rather it can induce a strong S antibody response. Alright folks, we are at the end of today's lecture. Let's take home some few points. The first point is that the hepatitis B profile only shows 5 parameters: the surface antigen and its antibody, the envelope antigen and its antibody, and lastly, the core antibody. The second point is that the antigens of the hepatitis B virus can be remembered by SEC, S-E-C. The third point is that whatever the antigen indicates, its corresponding antibody indicates the opposite. For example, when the S antigen indicates infection, its antibody is indicating immunity. When the E antigen is indicating replication or multiplication, its antibody is indicating redundancy or the period of muteness. The fourth point is that the survivor of a past infection got a particle which contains all the 3 antigens, but the vaccinated got the particle which contained only the S. And so in their interpretation, both of them would have the S antibody, but the survivor would have a positive C antibody, whereas the vaccinated would have a negative C antibody.